Hello and welcome to the Crime Lens channel. Today, we're diving into how a gang vanished in the strangest way imaginable. In the criminal world, empires rarely disappear. They usually end with gunfire, with blood, with names wiped off the streets. But there was once an empire that didn't die like that. No final shot. No fateful battle. Only silence spreading slow, cold, like someone turning off the lights in a crowded room. The men who once lived by the roar of engines, who believed power had to be seen and heard, suddenly vanished one day. No trace, no explanation. And then the most terrifying question emerged. What is powerful enough to kill an empire without firing a single bullet? Who truly wins when no one steps forward to claim the victory? In the history of organized crime, empires rarely disappear. They usually weaken, then collapse in violence. Some die in war, others fall under flashing blue and red lights, their names recorded as loud, final endings. We've grown accustomed to this. We believe power only leaves when it's broken by bullets. But Australia witnessed an exception, a collapse that didn't follow the old rules. No gunshots echoing in the night, no bodies on the pavement, no verdict read like a declaration of victory. Only silence slipping into every street corner, every clubhouse, every story once told with pride. That silence wasn't loud, but it was more terrifying than any gunshot. Because when shots are fired, people know they're in a war. But when silence drags on, no one knows whether the battle is over or whether they've already been left behind without realizing it. Those who once believed power had to be displayed, that fear had to be visible on another man's face, suddenly understood something darker. What was killing them didn't need to appear, it didn't need to threaten, it didn't need to announce itself, it only needed to wait. And in that empty space, a question began to haunt everything. If an empire can vanish without making a sound, then what truly controls the underworld gunfire, or the silence no one dares to name? In 2013, the city of Perth didn't just witness an event, it witnessed a feeling. The ground trembling beneath the wheels, the air thick with the smell of fuel, metal, and the cold confidence of men who believe they own this place. From early morning, convoys began to pour in. Not rushed, not chaotic. Everything unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a ritual rehearsed over many years. Hundreds, then nearly 1,000 motorcycles lined up in long formation, engines roaring not to show speed, but to declare presence. That roar wasn't aimed at the police. It was aimed at ordinary people, at the eyes watching from the sidewalks, at the instinct to lower one's head, even when no one laid a hand on them. These were no longer means of transportation. They were a stage. Each bike was a declaration. Each rider was a man finding meaning within that leather-clad army. For many of them, this wasn't just a parade. It was the moment they were seen, the moment they belonged, the moment they stood inside something larger than the narrow limits of their own lives. The symbol stitched onto their backs wasn't just fabric and ink. It was identity. It said they had brothers behind them, territory ahead of them, a place where rules were decided by presence, not paperwork. As the convoy passed, Perth seemed to hold its breath. Police were forced to deploy on an unprecedented scale greater than what was used for national-level visits. Yet even that presence was defensive. Because this was the moment the rebels wanted to be seen at their peak. In that instant, they were kings of the road. No need to raise their voices. No need for direct threats. The roar spoke for them. It said power was here, right now. And no one in that convoy imagined that this loud, unmistakable power would one day become the clearest sign of their own collapse. Behind the leather jackets and the roar of engines, not everyone was born wanting to live outside the law. Most of them came from very ordinary places, working-class neighborhoods, broken homes, childhoods shaped by the feeling of being overlooked. They didn't join because they loved violence. They joined because they wanted to be seen. For many, the rebels appeared as a promise. There was brotherhood, there was discipline, there were rules clearer than anything life had ever given them. When the outside world saw them only as failures, the leather jacket gave them a new identity, a name, a position, a feeling that they belong somewhere. Meetings, long rides, silent pats on the shoulder slowly replaced the families they never had or had already lost. In that space, recognition didn't come from praise. It came from holding the line, from not backing down, from being called brother. For many, that alone was worth the trade. But it was a distorted family, a family where affection always came with conditions, loyalty in exchange for protection, obedience in exchange for existence. Inside the circle, you were shielded. Step outside, and you were nobody. The recognition they sought became both the thing that held them up and the chain that bound their lives to a road with no exit. Inside that leather jacket, every man carried a deeply human hunger to be seen, to be respected, to belong. And it was that hunger that turned them into parts of a machine where the individual slowly disappeared, leaving only the symbol and blind loyalty, the thing they believed was family. Alex Vela was not born into power. He came from poverty, from a large immigrant family where life was measured in hard labor and frugal meals. His childhood offered no privilege and no easy way out, only an early confrontation with reality. If you don't stand up for yourself, you will be pushed down forever. He grew up in a world where strength was understood in simple terms. The tougher one survives, the hesitant one disappears. Boxing taught him how to endure pain. The streets taught him when to strike. And the rebels gave him what he had lacked his entire life, a place at the top. Vela did not rule through systems or bureaucracy. He ruled through people, through shared memory, through names he remembered, and debts he never forgot. His power was not written into bylaws. It lived in the eyes of the men beneath him. When he entered a room, order formed on its own. No commands, no arguments, only an understood silence. But that was also the problem. Everything revolved around one man. Every decision passed through a single mind. The rebels were strong because of Vela, and they were weak because of Vela. When power concentrates absolutely, it creates short-term stability but long-term fragility. There was no true successor, no system that could run on its own, only a single center holding everything together. At the height of his power, Vela was both symbol and burden. He carried an empire on his shoulders, and beneath it all was a loneliness only leaders understand. No one was truly a friend. No one could be trusted with the full truth. In a world built on absolute loyalty, loneliness became just as absolute. Alex Vela was more than a leader. He was the rope holding the rebels together, and when that rope was cut, everything began to fall, free and fast. The collapse of the rebels did not begin with an external enemy. It began quietly, from within, with the arrival of younger faces walking into the clubhouse. A new generation emerged, one that did not grow up with motorcycles, did not learn to rebuild engines in garages, and did not understand the value of long rides through cold nights. They were given a cold name, Nike Bikers. They wore sneakers instead of leather boots. They didn't come for ideals, but for opportunity. To them, the leather jacket was not a symbol of honor. It was a ticket, a pass into a world of power that was faster, richer, and more dangerous. Loyalty was no longer an oath, it became a calculation. In the past, joining meant belonging. Now, joining meant extracting value. Conversations inside the clubhouse no longer revolved around brotherhood, but around money, territory, and percentages. Who gained more? Who earned more? Who could climb higher without waiting? Suspicion crept into every glance. Handshakes no longer felt firm. Nods were no longer sincere. People stayed not because they trusted one another, but because they hadn't found something better yet. The rebels slowly turned into a black market, where loyalty had a price and betrayal was only a matter of timing. The most painful loss wasn't strength, it was trust. When an organization is built on brotherhood but operates on transactions, it is already dead from the inside. And at that point, all it takes is a very light touch for the entire empire to collapse on its own. The empire did not collapse in a night of bloodshed. It snapped in a moment that felt almost invisible. No sirens, no gunshots, just a cold administrative decision signed on paper. When Alex Vela left Australia and was never allowed to return, the rebels lost the sun of their own private solar system. For decades, the rebels' power was never about numbers. It was about one man, a familiar voice, a look strong enough to silence an entire room. When Vela was expelled, the void was more than a leadership gap. It was a spiritual one. No one had enough authority to give orders. No one inspired enough fear to be obeyed. The men who once stood beside him began to study one another. Who would replace him? Who had the right to decide? But power had been concentrated in one person for too long, and the organization had forgotten how to function on its own. There was no succession plan, no orderly transfer, only egos colliding in the dark. From exile, Vela became a king without a kingdom. At home, the rebels became a body without a head. Chapters began acting independently. Orders stalled. Hesitation spread faster than any war. That decapitation didn't require blood, but it left the entire empire reeling. And when an organization survives on personal authority, once its center is removed, collapse becomes only a matter of time. While the old kings were still staring into the mirror, trying to reclaim the authority they had lost, a different predator quietly entered the game. No engine noise, no flashy symbols, no parades through the streets. The Albanian mafia arrived like darkness, silent, precise, and cold. They were not born from leather culture or romantic dreams of outlaw freedom. They were shaped by clans, by shared meals, by blood oaths passed down through generations. For them, loyalty doesn't need to be proven with tattoos or patches. It is already carved into bloodlines. If the rebels thought in terms of territory, the Albanians thought in terms of markets. They didn't ask who controlled this street. They asked where the money flowed. They didn't compete through public violence. They optimized through logistics, supply chains, and profit. Their power made no noise. It strangled rivals slowly, with cheaper prices, steadier supply, and tighter networks. While bikers were still busy defending honor, the Albanians were signing invisible agreements. They cut out middlemen. They went straight to the source. They treated crime like a global business, where emotion is a liability and efficiency is the ultimate law. These men didn't need to be seen to be feared. They didn't need reputation. They needed control. And while the rebels still believed strength lived in presence, the new predator understood a brutal truth. In the modern world, whoever controls the market controls the fate of everyone else. While the new predator was quietly taking control of the market, the rebels chose to step onto a familiar stage. The stage of violence, of spotlights, of explosions that fed the ego. Rock Machine appeared not just as a rival, but as a public humiliation, a slap to their honor. And for the rebels, honor was something that always had to be answered with blood. The clashes no longer stayed in the shadows. They erupted in the streets, in bars, in front of security cameras, on newspaper front pages. Every punch, every gunshot, every leather jacket captured by the media carried the same message. We are still here. We are still strong. But the spotlight didn't only illuminate the enemy. It exposed every crack within the rebels themselves. The men in leather who entered that war carried more than loyalty. They carried exhaustion, fear, and the sense of being left behind in a world changing too fast. Public violence had once been the rebels' most powerful weapon. Now it became a loudspeaker for police, politicians, and public pressure. Every explosion became another reason for tighter laws. Every parade drew another map of their internal structure. Rock Machine understood provocation. They dragged the rebels into a war where the winner wasn't the one who struck hardest, but the one who made the other side most visible. And the rebels walked straight into the trap. They fought on the stage of an old century, where strength was measured by roar. But the world had changed. Under the harsh glare of the media, the rebels no longer looked like kings of the street. They looked like men desperately clinging to the past, with whatever desperation they had left. The underworld doesn't collapse in a single night. It trembles before it breaks. Phantom Secure vanished. and with it went the one thing people living outside the law trusted most: safety and silence. When the servers were shut down, when devices once treated like talismans turned into useless pieces of metal, panic spread faster than any bullet. Men who once issued orders with a glance now stared at empty screens. Messages no longer went through. Calls disappeared. Familiar networks dissolved into frightening gaps. For the first time in years, they were forced to face a raw, exposed feeling. No encryption, no protective layer, only quiet doubt gnawing at every thought. Trust is the rarest currency in the underworld, and Phantom Secure had been the bank of that trust. When it collapsed, every relationship came under suspicion. Who was listening? Who had already been watched? Who would betray others to save themselves? Those unanswered questions, thin meetings, lowered voices, and made eyes avoid one another. In that digital void, the human side showed itself most clearly. Fear, isolation, and a deep unease that the old era had ended. Not with gunfire, but with the silence of devices that once promised they would never betray. In the panic of the digital void, people instinctively reach for what feels familiar, a new shelter. A gnome appeared at exactly that moment, so quiet and so perfect that no one questioned it. A harmless-looking phone, a promise passed by word of mouth, absolute safety, unbreakable, no one listening. Men who had survived on instinct chose to believe, not because they were naive, but because they were exhausted, tired of running, tired of doubting one another. A&OM didn't sell technology. It sold reassurance, a deeply human feeling that, at last, they could slow their breathing. Messages were typed without hesitation. Sentences grew longer, more honest. Plans were shared like confessions between people who believed they were behind a locked door. They laughed. They boasted. They wrapped themselves in the sense of invincibility the underworld always craves. But the most dangerous trap was never technical. It was psychological. When people believe they are safe, they remove their final layer of defense. A nom didn't need to force anything. It only needed to wait for trust to bloom, to wait for confidence to turn into carelessness. And in that moment, every whisper had already been heard, not through violence, but through the cold patience of a trap built from the human need to trust. For the next 18 months, the darkness was no longer silent. It spoke, it whispered, it confessed. 27 million messages flowed across cold screens inside command rooms. They were no longer data, they were lives. Fear, ambition, a cruelty that was deeply human. The investigators sitting in front of those screens no longer felt like they were watching an enemy. They were listening to a world breathe. Some nights stretched into morning, each line of text appearing like a heartbeat. There were messages so calm they were chilling. Murder orders typed as casually as ordering a meal. Photos of contraband sent with emojis, a normalization of evil. There were also moments that froze entire rooms, messages sent to wives and children before a job, awkward apologies, fears of betrayal. In the darkness, they were not only criminals, they were exposed human beings, without masks, without stage lights. For investigators, the psychological burden was immense. Every message became a moral decision. Keep listening or intervene. Stay silent or save a life. Some murder plots were stopped in complete silence through a routine traffic stop, a legal pretext strong enough to prevent tragedy without exposing the trap. Time moved slowly. 18 months felt like a lifetime. The darkness grew used to being listened to without ever knowing it. And while the underworld believed it was speaking inside its most private room, on the other side of the screen were people holding their breath, taking notes, waiting for the moment the darkness would step into the light on its own. At dawn on the 8th of June 2021, darkness no longer protected anyone. The city was still asleep. The streets were quiet. But beneath that ordinary surface, a seismic shift was quietly spreading. Doors were knocked in the same rhythm, not frantic, not rushed, precise and cold. Inside many homes, men who believed they were still in control of the game were half awake. The phone lay on the table, beside the bed, just like every other night. The object that had given them a sense of safety for months. The thing they believed was untouchable. When the handcuffs closed, there was no violent resistance, only widened eyes, a hollow moment, as if someone had just pulled back the curtain, hiding the truth from their lives. Investigators read the messages back to them. Familiar words, plans once written with absolute confidence. Now they return not as whispers, but as sentences. Some tried to laugh, some broke down in tears, some fell into a silence that was frightening. In that moment, they understood something too late. This collapse did not come from enemies on the street. It came from the place where they had placed their trust. Ironside did not need gunfire. It did not need blood. It destroyed the underworld by taking away the most essential thing of all, trust between criminals. When trust breaks, every structure of power collapses with it. When the sun rose that morning, life outside went on as usual. People went to work, children went to school. But in another corner of society, an entire era had ended. Not with the massacre, but with the painful realization that all along, they had been telling their own story to the very people waiting for this day of judgment. After Judgment Day, the empire that once roared across the highways made no sound at all. The rebels did not collapse overnight. They broke apart, piece by piece, in a long and painful silence. There was no final meeting, no last oath, only growing emptiness inside clubhouses that had once been full. Leather jackets that once symbolized power now lay untouched in closets. Patches that once made others avert their eyes suddenly meant nothing. No one was afraid anymore. No one lowered their head. What once bound them through loyalty and pride had become nothing more than relics of a dead era. Betrayal emerged as a survival reflex. When trust was destroyed, people returned to instinct. Some walked away, some turned their backs. Some searched for survival by aligning with former enemies. Some chapters dissolved themselves. Others quietly stitched different patches onto their backs, as if changing names could rescue lost honor. The deepest pain wasn't arrest, it was abandonment. Being turned away by the very organization they had given their youth to. Men who once called each other brothers no longer answered the phone. No one stood up to protect anyone else. Brotherhood, once sworn as sacred, proved far more fragile than they had believed. The rebels didn't just lose people, they lost their reason to exist. A model built on display, territory, and fear no longer had a place. As the underworld shifted to operating in the shadows, through networks and data, those who needed the spotlight to survive were forced to disappear. This disintegration wasn't loud, it looked like extinction. No one heard a final cry. Only later did people realize that what had once dominated an entire era was gone. Not because it had grown weaker, but because the world had changed, and the old model could no longer survive. When the engine noise finally died out, the world did not become more peaceful. It only became quieter. Power did not disappear. It changed shape. It no longer needed convoys, no longer needed symbols, no longer needed an entire city to hear it. The power of the new era lives in closed rooms, invisible streams of data, and decisions made in absolute silence. The final lesson is not only for the rebels, it is for anyone who believes strength must be displayed. In this century, the most dangerous figure is not the loudest one, but the one who leaves no trace. No need for recognition, no need to be feared, only the ability to operate smoothly in the dark. Somewhere, men who once wore leather jackets now live anonymous lives. Some feel regret, some feel relief. Some still cling to memories of a time when power roared across asphalt. But the world no longer has room for that nostalgia. It has moved into a different era, colder and more efficient. Modern power does not ask who you are. It asks what you control. Information, money, flow, trust. And when those things are in someone else's hands, every symbol once worshipped becomes empty. This story does not close with a neat ending. It opens a quiet, unsettling question. In a world where power no longer makes a sound, Are we alert enough to recognize it when it stands right beside us? Or do we only realize after everything has already shifted in silence? The same way an empire once believed to be immortal disappeared, not in gunfire, but in the long, drawn-out quiet of a new age.